In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, CEO of Eden Research, Sean Smith talks about science fairs in Kansas City, intellectual property as an asset class, and quite a lot besides. I'm joined today by Sean Smith. Sean graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in microbiology, and he's worked at various companies, including Shell, General Electric, and Honeywell. And since 2014, has been the Chief Executive Officer at Eden Research. Sean, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, good afternoon. Glad to be here.
So, Sean, before we talk about your interesting and varied career, I want to go back to the beginning. So, can you take us back to Kansas?
Sure, absolutely. I guess it's hard to say where to start precisely with that, but I guess maybe the bit where it starts to become a little bit more relevant to modern day, what would I do today, and my career up to this point anyway, was when I was in high school and actually even junior high school, I was definitely part of the cool group of kids who were very involved in science fairs and all things related to science. And that was largely out of interest, as a set of topics. I always found the sciences to be the most interesting, the most sort of engaging, the things that caught my attention, honestly, more than anything else. And so it was a pretty easy one. I don't having not grown up here, but in the US, I can't really draw a comparison. But we had these. It was a fairly common thing across the US, which are these sort of science fairs, where you have kids who are doing science projects, and they present them in a series of local, regional, even national science competitions, if you will. And this is really where I started to get hooked, was that in high school, a very good friend of mine um, was lucky enough, and I can't recall exactly how the opportunity came about for him, but was lucky enough to start working on this science project at one of the local university research groups. And I came by to visit him one day, and he was showing me what he was doing, working in this really cool lab. And it was kind of, I would say next level to what we were doing in high school, but it was more than that. It was a good few levels up. And I was absolutely blown away. And at that point, I kind of caught the bug. So this is where my real interest in science and working in a lab and a career in science began. And it was from, really inspiration from this friend of mine, David, but
What was his
also
project?
he was he was working on something, and I was afraid you might ask me that question. I tried to remember exactly, but it had something to do with basically working with expression vectors, gene expression vectors at the time, and coming up with novel ways of expressing bacterial, viral proteins, et cetera, et cetera. And it all seemed like amazing to me because we were really only learning about molecular biology and at a very, very superficial level. And here's this friend of mine working in a lab, cutting plasmids open and inserting genes into them. And I'm kind of go, wow, like I can't even fathom that. So like, well beyond what I'd conceived of. And so I sort of thought that kind of copied what he was doing. Not the project per se, but I got very interested in it. And it was because he and I both had some super inspirational high school science teachers. There were really three of them in our high school who were really notable. And they were really inspirational and encouraged us to do this stuff. And it was fun. It was interesting.
Do you remember
The
their
whole
names?
Oh yeah. Mr. Frisbee, Mr. Moling, and Dr. Humphreys. So yeah, they were really really notable. I haven't been in touch with them in many many years, of course, but I did stay in touch with them for a good few years afterwards because these individuals, I even at that age where you're quite well, one quite self-focused, I suppose, when you're 17, 18, 19, whatever. Even at that age where I was kind of filled with thoughts of myself, I've really remarked at how inspirational these folks were, and yeah, so that sort of got my interest going, and I entered university with a plan to study science. I wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do, but I was pretty sure I wanted to do something in the area of molecular biology. And I went to the University of Kansas. I did my bachelor's degree in technically in microbiology with a focus on molecular biology, and worked in a lab and did all that fun stuff. But it was all built on this first sort of exposure that I had in high school, thanks to the kind of inspirational teaching of a few key individuals at a pretty normal high school.
Mm. It just shows you, doesn't it, what an impact your surroundings have on you. Um,
Yeah.
so you're at university. You did well there. You graduated with your degree. Um, at that point, were you quite clear about how you were going to apply it in real life, or was it still a
Yeah,
question?
so at university, it was kind of an interesting one because as I mentioned to you, excuse me, a little bit earlier, I consider myself, although I have a background in science, I really consider myself more of a commercial person and a business person who happens to love science. And what I particularly like is the intersection between science and business. That's the area that I get very excited about. And I had this opportunity. So I was studying microbiology. I had every intention in the world of going off and doing a PhD and then continuing. And I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with all that, but I knew that more science is good, more education is good. And it was sort of by chance. I was really fortunate enough to have my father was working for a major multinational consumer products brand company who had a competitive selective summer internship program for the employees sorry, for the children of employees. And so my father mentioned this to me, maybe you'd like to do this. And I thought, well, what am I going to be doing? And well, you're going to be doing consumer products marketing and merchandising, which is a nice way of saying going around to supermarkets and putting cans of various products on shelves and nothing much sexier than that. But it paid $6 an hour. So I was very excited about that. And because I think at the time, I hate to date myself, but I will, I think the minimum wage was something like three it was $3.35 an hour, and this was $6 an hour. So clearly, I was going to go for that. I went for it. I was lucky enough to get it, and I spent one summer chasing cans of insecticide. Ironically, given what I do now, chasing them around all supermarkets and trying to do what I was supposed to be doing there. And it was an really interesting experience. But even at that stage in my life, I was thinking to myself, well, this is fine. I'm not going to do this for a living. This is fine. It's okay. Um, but I found that during the course of that first summer, I actually wound up quite enjoying myself. And I realized that I had some aptitude for sales and commerce in general, which I never quite imagined that I had. And I realized that the ability to convince somebody to do something that maybe initially they were reluctant to do was something I really, was an interesting skill. And I did that for the first summer. I was invited back for the second summer. I thought, well, sure, it's now I think it's 650 an hour or something like that. And I thought, hey, that's even better. I'll do this again. But by the time the summer just before my final year of university, so these are 4-year degrees, just before my final year, um, I decided, well, I'm not going to be a consumer product salesperson. I'm not going to go to work for P&G or Unilever or any of these guys. I'm definitely doing something in science. So I was quite fortunate in that my supervisor, excuse me, was hugely supportive and helped me to find a space in a lab group at our university that was doing exactly what I wanted to do. And so I had sort of the perfect opportunity working for absolutely, kind of the dream lab working for the individual who at the time I think was he was sort of the protege of a former Nobel Prize winner, and it was a very prestigious group to get into, and I was somehow fortunate enough to get in there. So it was perfect product, perfect project, perfect place, all of it. You couldn't have checked any more boxes. It was a dream. And I started doing that over the summer. And I remember a couple of weeks into it, after standing in an ice cold containment lab, wearing a coat and a lab coat, all by myself for the better part of a day, pipetting, I don't know, thousands of samples. I thought to myself, I'm not really sure that as much as I find the work really super interesting, I'm not really sure this is what I want to be doing. And I actually kind of miss crawling around on supermarket floors and trying to convince grocery store managers to do what I wanted them to do. And I kind of missed that interaction with other people. And honestly, working by yourself in a containment lab all day, a good number of days every week, started to kind of, well, it was missing some of the stuff I like doing. And I, at that point, decided that although my supervisor had sort of mapped out what he saw as a reasonable path forward for me, doing a PhD, doing a postdoc, I even had a collaborator lined up at another university, and I finally had to break the news to him that I was desperate to take a break between that and graduate school, and that I was gonna have to go earn some money. And I remember him saying to me, he was a very hardworking guy. He said, if you leave, you won't come back." And I said, "No, no, no, I'm coming back. I just need to work for a year. I need to pay off some debt. I need to, kind of have a little bit of money in my pocket, and then I'm ready to go." And he said, "You won't do that. Everybody that leaves doesn't come back." And I remember thinking to myself, well, if that's the case, then I think you've just told me what I want to do. But I went off and got a job in industry, and for me, what I really wanted to do was ensure that I was working in a scientific discipline. I did not want to leave 4 years of pretty hard work behind, and a good year of solid lab experience doing some really interesting stuff. I didn't want to leave that behind. I wanted to be able to leverage that education, leverage, the investment that my parents made in me and that I made myself. And I wanted to somehow combine the two, the best of both worlds. And that's sort of how I wound up in the chemical industry, and it was by chance. I considered roles in pharmaceuticals, I considered roles in medical devices, I consider it was sort of everything that had to do that I could conceive of, that had to do with some intersection between science and science-based businesses and what I believed my my skill sets were.
Mm. It's so interesting to hear that the desire quite early on to combine to have make sure that you do transfer those skills over, because I'm not sure that that happens for everyone. Um, so you went to interview for your first job, as it were, in your new life, your new world. Um, what was that? I'm looking at
My
what I
my
can.
Yeah, my first job was in it was in a management development program. I think you probably have it down as GE now, but actually at the time the company was a fairly small to medium company. It was quite well diversified across the oil and gas sector. They were quite well known for what are called enhanced oil recovery techniques, which today you'd call fracking, but at the time was just oil recovery. And yet I worked for a small specialty division within that company that was doing low molecular weight polymers for a whole bunch of different applications. And I wound up in a kind of a development program where I had some commercial responsibilities. And it was sort of here we're going to train you, we're going to babysit you while you grow up a little bit more, and then we're going to give you some experience, and then you're going to move into. But it was very much a commercial role, and I sort of evolved from that into a marketing role where I was doing. And when I say marketing, I mean this is technical marketing. It's not kind of figuring out consumer product marketing strategies. This was, we have a additive that you put into printing inks, and the additive does the following things. And now we need to work out a strategy to convince all the major printing ink manufacturers in the world. So it was that kind of thing. And then I moved from that into a kind of a regional account manager type role, and I, all that stuff I liked because it was all pretty technical. It very much, all these roles were very much combining a reasonable understanding of the science, and the characteristics of the products that we're selling with this sort of commercial set of functions that I was responsible for, such as growing sales, negotiating contracts, devising product management strategies, blah 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 blah. So it was sort of all that stuff. So for me, it was perfect. And in all honesty, I wound up in the chemical industry rather than an adjacent industry, similar industry, perhaps pharma or medical devices, etc., because it was a bit more technical. I had really seriously considered, and I actually was lucky enough to have a couple of job offers coming out of uni, going into pharmaceutical sales. But I did something which I surprised myself now with my thinking about it quite as well as, or as much as I had. I'd asked my family doctor what he thought of pharmaceutical sales reps. And he said, God, don't do that. And I remember he was really adamant about it. Now, this is a guy who'd been our family doctor since I was, a kid. So he was very adamant. He said, I don't have time for those people. I don't, my nurses don't have time for them. They come around, they give us pens, they send us on trips, and I don't want to have those conversations. Now, I don't think that was a fair characterization, because I had a number of friends that worked in doing that, and it always sounded like an interesting and kind of fun job to me. But I took what he said very, very seriously, and I said, well, I don't want to do that. Then that would be wrong. So um, I'll go into this chemical industry job. It's kind of interesting, funky chemistry, and it's the basis of an awful lot of consumer products. So I find that interesting, and that's how I wound up kind of on that path, if you will.
Mm. And then at some point there was a bit of a pivot um, from the commercial side. Actually, I wouldn't mind just like, well, you've sort of described it a little bit, but maybe we'll just do that a bit more. But there was a pivot from that commercial side into the intellectual property side. And I wonder, I mean, we can make assumptions as to why you attempted to do that. But it would be nice to hear what inspired you to do that.
Well, and I'm going to date myself yet again, but the chemical industry when I joined, which was a while ago, was fairly stagnant, and although I was quite happy with the path I originally got on in the industry and how it provided me with an opportunity to combine my interest in science with my interest in business, the industry as a whole felt a little bit like it was sinking, and there was a lot of pressure, a lot of commoditization of specialty products, a lot of the effects of globalization resulting in a lot of the industry moving from Europe and North America to China, India, what have you. And so it felt a little bit like wrong place, wrong time for me. And I was actually working at Honeywell, managing a pretty good sized business. At the time, it was about $125 million a year business. So probably one of the bigger businesses that I'd managed up to that point, certainly. And um, the Honeywell was, I think still is, a company who is very much focused on the numbers. So as a publicly listed high profile company, the job was always you make the number, you don't exceed the number, you definitely don't miss the number, don't be a hero, hit the number. That's what you're being asked to do. And and I learned a lot of creativity there. We would do crazy things to make sure that we made the number. Because again, you were never thanked for beating it, and you were definitely not thanked for missing it. And so, excuse me, I got involved in a group of individuals who were managing the intellectual property portfolio of that business and began to realize that actually patents are like assets and we can trade them, we can buy them, we can sell them, we can leverage them in different ways. I was absolutely fascinated by that concept. I loved this idea of intangible assets as an asset class. And I started to get very, very excited about that. And so I began working with those individuals, trying to just find ways that we could pull some levers to make the numbers in a given quarter or a given year through licensing transactions. And I was lucky enough to work with a pretty professional team of people doing that. So I learned a lot very quickly. And at some point, whilst working there and getting involved more and more in this kind of thing, I was I met a woman in a bar, and we started having this conversation about what she did, and she told me that she was working for this California-based startup that was basically developing an online exchange for intellectual property. And I was like, wow, that's really cool, And I hadn't quite appreciated at this point that not only was she cute, but she was super bright and, kind of next level bright. And she started telling me all this stuff, and I was like, wow, that's really fascinating. So I'd love to learn more about that sometime. And as you did, exchanged business cards, and I kind of didn't think much about it. And about a week later, I had a call from her saying, you told me you were interested in this. How'd you like to come out and interview for a job? And I said, well, I don't know about that, and she said, oh, we'll pay for you to come to California. You can spend the weekend with us. You'll have a bunch of interviews. You'll be home by Sunday night. And I thought, well, why not? Let's do that. So I went out, met with a small team of super bright individuals, including her. One thing led to another. They offered me a role, and I started working for what was then called the Patent and License Exchange. And the Patent and License Exchange was all about, we were a bit ahead of our time, bluntly.
Mm.
We had raised quite a lot of money through venture capital, and we were trying to build an online exchange for IP rights with a pretty comprehensive set of tools to sort of support that. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about IP valuations. I learned a lot about licensing deals. And from that point forward, I started to really focus my commercial interests on licensing as a transaction and intellectual property as an asset class. And it felt a lot more dynamic and, felt a lot more like the future than the chemical industry did at the time. Which is ironic because today I actually think that the chemical industry is in a position where it is far more innovative and interesting and dynamic than it's possibly ever been. Possibly with the exception of, say, the 1930s and 40s, where there was a lot of kind of interesting discovery happening. Today it's all driven by regulation, and we love to hate regulation, and I certainly love to hate regulation in my current role, but it is driving innovation in our industry, and it is the fuel behind what we're doing. It's what really drives what we're doing, because regulation isn't going to get any easier. So that means we have to become more innovative, more clever, more creative, etc.
Mm. And there's a lot of regulation around intellectual property nowadays. I'm not even sure how a patent and license exchange would fare in today's.
Well, there's no real regulation around it then. What I'm really referring to here in the context of regulation is chemical product regulation.
Sure.
So things like, I mean, and some of your listeners may be familiar with REACH or the biocidal products regulation, or in our industry, the plant protection products regulations. These are significant sets of rules that define pretty much every aspect of our business.
Mm.
And so IP at the time as an asset class, and I think even today, isn't that highly regulated. There are a set of rules around,
Right, exactly.
patent.
Timings more than anything.
Yeah, and yes, and it's largely when you're talking about the asset itself, you're talking about well, quite often registered rights such as patents, trademark, etc. Increasingly fewer and fewer registered rights and more of an interest in development of the know-how space, which is all kind of interesting. But regulation-wise, not so much. But it's a lot of legal work goes into patents and their usefulness and what they do and don't allow you to do. But that's much more on the legal, the kind of patent lawyer side of things, and that is very super technical, not necessarily highly regulated, although there are a set of rules around what is patentable and what is not, and obviously the substance of what those individuals do is very much around that. But no,
Mhm.
but in the chemical industry, and in particular in the plant protection product industry, regulation is, it plays a very big role in what we do.
Mm. And I think we should go on to your time at Eden now, because you have been there for 10 years.
I have,
You
yes.
are in charge.
Well,
And a couple of years ago, you won a prize, or a Green Economy Mark. And that's based on the different types of things that you actually produce. And this class of natural products, it's like a building block, and biosynthesis building block, or a major biosynthesis building block, um, the terpene active ingredients. And that sort of feels to me in quite a lot of contrast compared to some of the things that you were doing early on in your career.
yeah, I mean, it's sort of an evolution, is I guess how I would like to see it. I think going back to what I was literally just saying about regulation is driving the industry toward more and more sustainable approaches to solve problems. And Eden wasn't the first company to recognize that plant-derived chemistry could actually be harnessed to solve problems. But we were among the first to be
Mm.
very, um, and we are among the first to develop, register, and successfully commercialize products that are derived from plant chemistry in order to solve other problems that the same plants might have during professional production in agriculture or horticulture. So, not it's not that I in the past was not at all interested in sustainability. It's just more that it's become an increasingly important factor in our industry, and for good reason.
Mm.
Consumers are massively concerned about pesticide residues, for example. Maybe I should say really quickly what Eden does.
Yeah,
If
do.
I'm not assuming that everybody knows, 'cause we are a very small AIM-listed company, UK-based AIM-listed company. We employ about 25 people in South Oxfordshire, in a place called Milton Park. And what we do is we focus on the development of products to support farmers in professional agriculture and horticultural applications. And what that means is we develop friendly pesticides, if you will. And so we do that using a set of tools which are basically all derived from plant chemistry or other natural sources, and I can go into that in a little bit. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is replace synthetic, conventional pesticide chemistry with more sustainable alternatives to that. Now, that's not to say that all pesticides are bad. That's not to say that, all conventional chemistry is bad. I've worked in the industry my entire career, and I find that to be such a blunt instrument and such a kind of a silly way to look at it. We don't see conventional chemistry as the enemy. We see conventional chemistry as a tool, and we are providing a different tool, and those tools are quite often complementary rather than duplicative. And yes, as conventional chemistry is increasingly scrutinized and ultimately removed from the market, and we see that happening almost every day, products such as those that we're developing have a bigger and bigger role to play. So ultimately, will you see all the conventional chemistry replaced with bio-derived alternatives? Probably not in the short term, but is that a general direction of travel? Yeah, it is. And so for us, what we're really trying to do is develop replacements or complementary products for the conventional chemistry to help growers to produce in a much more sustainable way, without losing efficacy. And I've heard people say, and I know there are some politicians who I won't name, but who seem to think, particularly in Europe, who seem to think that banning pesticides, and I've literally heard speeches where people have said, well, the solution is to ban pesticides. And I think, well, then the answer to that, to that solution, the outcome of that is going to be a lot of very expensive food and a lot of people who can't afford to eat. And, I'm not overly dramatizing that. It's such a naive way of looking at it. It really reveals the lack of understanding that some politicians seem to have when it comes to, and policymakers, when it comes to what a farmer's requirements are. And everybody's familiar with farmers complaining about the weather and this, that, and the other, and lack of subsidies. And, there's a long list of things that farmers complain about, but they're doing an absolutely difficult job and an essential job. And our job is to help them to do what they do as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that's why conventional chemistry, when it comes to crop protection products, came about, was to help farmers achieve those objectives. Now, some of those products, some of that chemistry has unintended consequences associated with its use. So what we're trying to do is work with our industry partners to evolve a much more well-considered and sustainable approach. And that's where our focus is.
And it's working quite well. You've transformed the organization since you've been there. You've got full-time scientists in-house from being an outsourcing setup to an in-house setup.
Given what we've been talking about, and maybe it's not surprising, I believe I was actually hired because I had a background in intellectual property licensing. And the company at the time was conceived as a IP licensing company. So it made some sense. I had an industry background, I had relevant experience in the industry, and yet I'm also bringing to the table this licensing experience. And I began to realize every industry is different. And I know that's a bit of a cliche thing to say, but every industry is different. Every industry's approach to certain opportunities is a bit different. And we were trying to do sort of a square peg and a round hole scenario with licensing. A lot of people in the industry, particularly 10 years ago, weren't particularly familiar with licensing as a business model. Even very simple things like trying to negotiate a license agreement. I remember having people say, well, we don't do that. We don't, that's not how it works. And it was as if all of our potential partners were saying to us, can you just sell us the product, please? And when you hear that a few times and you realize the kind of headwind that's there to do a meaningful license deal. This isn't biotech, it's not pharma. There are a few other industries where licensing is quite a conventional tool. This isn't that. And the risk reward profile is quite different. So it took us a little while to realize that we needed to look at alternative business models. And so we re-engineered the business model and went from a licensing company, which I was hired to run, to a product development and commercialization company. So today we are making the products, we're developing new products, we're selling them through commercial partners in countries all over the world, actually.
It sounds like the archetypal success story.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, it's kind of funny to say this, and I'm sure some of our investors would not love hearing me say that, it's been 10 years. That seems like a really long time. And yet, for me, in this industry, 10 years is really not that long of a time. Things move slowly. And that's primarily because of regulation. Partially it's because our customers, our ultimate customers, are farmers and they're conservative, and farmers use what works, and if it isn't broken, you're not going to fix it, kind of a mentality. That's less of a factor, actually, because what although that's a bit of a stereotype of farmers, actually the most successful farmers that I know are super innovative, and they adopt things very quickly. They might be a little reluctant. They are risk averse in some respects, but in other respects, they're really not. So when they see something compelling, they can tend to move quite quickly. The real issue is regulation in our industry, and the example I quite often give is, when we bring a product to market, we have to get authorization for it from the relevant authorities. So, in France, it's an entity called ANSES, and ANSES authorizes all crop protection products. You go to the regulator and you say, I would like approval to use this product to treat this disease on this crop, and they give you exactly that. What they don't give you is approval for the same product on the same crop for a different disease,
Mm.
or same disease on a different crop. It is, you get what you ask for. And when you ask for a lot, for example, I want this product approved on these 10 crops to treat these 4 diseases, they're going to say to you, okay, well, we need 2 seasons worth of data. And here we're talking about GEP standard data, right? To prove that the product works. You also, of course, have to prove that it's safe, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big order. And
Mm.
so the development of our business has been slower than we would like, but given that we have historically been significantly undercapitalized, when you only have the money to go after one disease on one crop in one country, well, that's what you're going to do. And your fate, your kind of commercial fate is tied to what that opportunity looks like in any given year. And by the way, in agriculture, you might have absolutely horrendous disease problems one year, and then have 3 years where that disease is not even present. And so you have to deal with the sort of fickle nature of, I mean, I've said before, it's biology plus chemistry plus weather plus people plus regulation. And that gives you the full picture. And it's not that any one of those is more impactful at any given time. They sort of swap around a little bit. And so
Mm.
it creates quite a complex picture, but all that to say, we are making good progress. We're sort of accelerating over the course of the last 4.5, almost 5 years now. We've finally been able to raise a much more meaningful amount of money. And we're putting that money to good use. Over that same period of time, we've developed 2 completely new products. Those new products are, one of them is sort of semi-commercial at the moment under an emergency or temporary use permit, and the other one is at the beginning of the regulatory approvals process.
Mm.
Um, those are all products we've developed in-house with our own team, and I'm really proud to be able to say that because we've got a really outstanding team of largely young scientists from all over the world working in our facilities in Milton Park, and they're doing great stuff, and they're really, it's fun to see because they're all very committed and they're all very passionate about it, and they work hard, which is great.
And it's very good to hear when you think about what we've got to do, in terms of helping farmers to grow twice as much food on half as much land in a very short time is not not going to be an easy task. So
Yeah.
um I guess on that note, I could carry on talking or listening rather to you for a long time, but we're going to run out of time. But before we finish, I just want to ask you what your hope hopes are for the future of science.
Yeah, it's a challenging question. It seems a fairly straightforward question, but there's a lot of places to go with that.
Mm.
For me, and I don't know, this is my own personal perception, so I could be getting this wrong or kind of understanding the situation wrong. But since COVID, it feels like there's been a real acceleration of the interest in science among the general population. And that's everywhere from, kids in school and A levels and GCSEs and interest in the sciences, all the way through to the general public taking an interest. And then I do think, if there were many upsides to the pandemic, possibly one of those upsides could be a greater level of awareness of science in general, the importance that scientists play in our day-to-day life. And what I suppose I'd love to see, and I have, for various reasons, I have some fear that maybe we're going in some respects the wrong direction. But what I would like to see for the future of science and society as a whole is an ongoing trend in that direction, an ongoing recognition of the importance of data and of robust data analysis and of good experimental design. And one of the things that we really look for in our team is people who know how to design an experiment. And it's not a trivial thing. All the scientists who are listening, real scientists who are listening to this, will be rolling their eyes and pulling their hair out when I say this. But for me, as a business person, I still really personally value great experimental design, because you can't answer the question if you don't ask it in the right way. And to me, I'd like to see that continue to be important in science. I'd like the emphasis to be re-emphasized, if you will, because I think in some scientific endeavors, the importance of that has maybe faded away a little bit. People refer to, particularly in the US with the political dynamic there, the kind of post-truth era. I'd like to see that, let's come back to the truth, let's come back to facts, let's come back to, great quality research and integrity, and that would be what I'd ask for. Nothing major, nothing is
No step change in society whatsoever.
no, just all very simple stuff. So yeah,
Brilliant. Well, Sean, thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure. And very grateful that you could spend some time with us today.
likewise. Thanks for the interview. It was enjoyable, actually.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.